Greetings everyone. I'm Dr. Samili Navaratna and I'm thrilled to have you join us today as we embark on this research quest. In this comprehensive research methodology lecture, we'll delve into the art of crafting meaningful research questions and objectives. So, join us as we demystify the process of translating complex clinical scenarios into focused research inquiries. Whether you are a student, a researcher, or a healthcare professional, this lecture will equip you with the essential skills to embark on successful research endeavors and make a real impact in the field. So, without much ado, let's move on to the next slide. In this slide, I have listed out the learning outcomes. So, by the end of this lecture, the student should be able to translate a clinical, public health or a health related problem into a research question, to state the reasons for writing objectives, to identify the difference between general and specific objectives, to define the characteristics of research objectives. So, the research process refers to the systematic and organized approach followed by researchers to investigate a specific topic or a problem at hand to obtain a reliable or a valid solution. So, the process begins with a perceived problem, an issue or a gap which the person may choose to ignore or avoid. But then again, an inquisitive mind, a critical mind will want to research the problem. So the research process typically involves the steps that I'll be showing you now. So it begins with the research question, then the setting of the research objectives, laying down proper methodologies, then implementation. That is, you go to the particular research setting and collect the data. Then you analyze the collected data. Then you arrive at conclusions based on your analysis. And based on your conclusions, ultimately you make recommendations. Then you have your solution. So this whole process is also known as the, a golden thread, because there's a continuity, right? It's important. The golden thread of a research process refers to the logical and coherent connection between each of these steps. Okay. So, starting initially from the research question to the final conclusions. So, there's a connection. So, that is what is known as the golden thread of the research process. So, moving on. So, first we need to know what a research problem is and what a research question is. So, let's see. A research problem refers to a perceived issue, difficulty, or gap in knowledge that is being addressed through the research project. So, then what a research question is? A research question refers to a statement in the form of a question to address the research problem or a part of it. Okay? So, before you start a research, before you even think of researching a problem at hand, you need to take into consideration certain criteria because otherwise you might get into problems. So, first and foremost, you need to think of the feasibility, whether you can really do this, whether there are enough, resources, logistics, and so on and so forth, and even whether the time is enough for you to finish this, if you are doing an undergraduate research project or a postgraduate research project, then there are time constraints. So you need to have that in mind. Then the relevancy. So it should be relevant to you, your interests, your sponsors' interests, and so on. Then the need, the use, the burden. So it has to be a real, help to the public or the governments or your institutions or whatever, then you need to think whether this is going to be a duplication of somebody else's work, because then it's not ethical and you are wasting other people's time and resources on just a mere duplication. So then you need to, other than the duplication, there are other ethical considerations you need to think of, right? Then administrative considerations also matters here. So all these criterions are important in selecting a researchable problem. So moving on to mind maps and problem analysis diagrams. So this slide gives you an example of a mind map. So these are actually the mind maps and the problem analysis diagrams are valuable tools that can significantly aid researchers when selecting a research title or a question. So they provide a structured and visual way to explore ideas, identify connections, and analyze potential research topics. So mind maps and problem analysis diagrams are powerful aids in the research topic selection process, therefore. Okay, so each branch can be now as you can see, there are so many branches here. The healthy lifestyles or healthy living can be related to exercise, vitamins, the body, the fitness, the gym, the mental well-being, whatever. So each of these branches can be further expanded with specific practices, tips or subtopics, and they can be directly or indirectly related to healthy lifestyles. So the mind map, in a nutshell, illustrates how different aspects of a healthy lifestyle in this regard are interconnected and contribute to overall well-being of a person. So they promote creativity, organization, and clarity, helping researchers identify meaningful and relevant research questions that contribute to the advancement of knowledge in their respective fields. So remember, the beauty of mind maps lies in their flexibility and ability to adapt. So you can, add, modify or expand on the branches based on your specific interests or research focus. So it's not restrictive. It's very, a liberal way of finding various researchable topics and ideas, generating new methodologies and so on and so forth. Moving on to the problem analysis diagrams. So this is one type of problem analysis diagrams. So it is a fishbone diagram. So as you can see, the individual bones represent the causes and the fish head represent the effect. Okay, in this case, the healthy lifestyle. So the fishbone diagram virtually represents the different factors of causes that contribute to a healthy lifestyle in this slide. And the branches, the individual bones in this case, indicate various aspects of healthy lifestyle, healthy lifestyles that lead to the effect represented by the head. And in this scenario, it's the healthy lifestyle. So physical causes like exercise, yoga, jogging, going to gym and sports. Then emotional aspects like education, forgiving and forgetting, letting go, something like that, and writing journals, positive attitudes, then talking to a friend, are listed under the emotional fishbone. And then the mental aspects like reading, creativity, and learning new skills, good self-esteem, And then the spiritual ones like meditating, praying, so many things have been listed. And of course, you can expand on this. You can add more fish bones, like the branches like fish bones, and then you can add various things under those uh, fish bones also. So this slide shows you the other type of problem analysis diagrams, that is the problem tree. So what is a problem tree? A problem tree is also known as an issue tree or a logic tree, and it's a very useful visual tool used in problem analysis, as the name suggests, and research planning or project planning. And the problem tree helps to visually map out the relationships between the core research, the core problem. So in this case, the unhealthy lifestyles, since we were talking about it, and its underlying root causes and the consequences. So the root causes actually are represented by the roots of the tree, and the consequences by the branches and the leaves. So the trunk gives you the core problem. That is the, if you are going back to our example, it's the unhealthy lifestyles. So in this case, as you can see, the root causes can be given under lack of awareness and environmental and social factors, or lack of motivation and support, or any other roots that you can think of, right? And the consequences can be branched out as physical consequences, mental consequences, and social consequences. And it helps to systematically identify the root causes and the consequences of a particular issue or a problem. So now if you can take your time and go through these root causes and consequences that I have listed out for this problem we were discussing in the previous slide also, that is the unhealthy lifestyles, you would see that you can even branch out with from these other small consequences and the root causes that I have listed here. So this is another example for the problem tree, and the problem tree illustration gives the problem, as stated in the trunk, the teenage girls' sexual and reproductive health. So you can think along these lines. Now the root causes are the high-risk behaviors, poverty, lack of information, gender inequality, and lack of access to contraceptive methods. And you can even, give more causes like this. And then the consequences are given in these circles, inside the circles. Moving on to the conceptual framework. So what is a conceptual framework? Let's see. A conceptual framework is in a research, it's a theoretical model, I think. So it's a structure that outlines the key concepts, the theoretical concepts, basically the variables and the assumptions underlying them, and the relationships between variables in a particular proposed study. So it provides a kind of a roadmap to understand the research problem, and therefore it guides the formulation of the research question. And it even helps in the data analysis and other things later on in the research. So it's kind of a an essential component in research. And if you can remember the things we discussed about this golden thread of research earlier. So if you take the golden thread as, you know, two strands tangled together, the one strand would be the conceptual framework and the other the analytical framework. So they are kind of, you know, intertwined. Both are necessary components. So in this conceptual framework, now I have put this simple diagram here. So let's think of an independent variable and a dependent variable. So in this case, because we were discussing about the healthy lifestyle, let's say we prefer the dependent variable to be obesity, then the independent variables can be the diet or the exercise or stress. So we can just show the direction of the relationship like this. So right, so the dependent variable and the independent variable, the diet, the exercise and the stress, leads to the obesity. So this is a very simple format of a conceptual framework. So let's see how we can translate a clinical problem, you know, a researchable clinical problem into a research question. So this table gives you the problem domains and the types of questions that you can come up with. You can add many more, but just some examples to give you the idea. So firstly, the clinical evidence, or in clinical examination, you may come up with questions like, you know, how often a disease causes its clinical manifestations, or what are the clinical symptoms of a disease, and how information could be gathered based on symptoms and signs, and so on and so forth. Well, if you are interested in the problem domain, etiology or risk factors, then the types of questions that might come into your head would be like, you know, what are the causes of diseases and what are the risk factors that cause a given disease or a condition. And if you are in particular interested in diagnosis of a disease, then what is the best diagnostic test for a given disease? What are the cutoff points, accuracy, precision, acceptability, and the cost effectiveness of this new diagnostic test? You know, if you are comparing to tests, then if the problem domain you are interested is therapy, then what are the best treatment modalities, the best dosage, the best effective dosage and frequency for a given drug, adverse effects, cost benefit, etc. And then prognosis wise, what is the clinical course of a given disease, the survival period in critical illnesses. Then if you are concerned about the frequency of diseases, how often can a disease manifest, and if you are a public health professional or a community physician like me, if you are interested in preventive medicine, then how to prevent a given disease, how to reduce the chance of developing a disease by identifying and, you know, modifying risk factors, then, you know, studying about the epidemiology, the trends of a disease, the disease burden, then other available services, facilities, things like that, and how to diagnose the disease early by screening. So all these types of questions can be translated through, you know, a perceived risk problem in your clinical setting. Okay. So, okay, now in this slide and the next slide, I have tabulated 4 examples. I have taken 4 examples from the 4 main domains in medicine, clinical medicine, that is, you know, the surgery medicine, pediatrics, and obs and gynae. So in the first example, let's say the area of interest is non-communicable diseases. So this is an example taken from medicine. And the health issue, let's say it's hypertension. And say the researcher is particularly interested in the metabolic syndrome. So the population and setting may be the medical clinics at the National Hospital Kandy and Teaching Hospital Peradeniya. Then your problem and the research question would be metabolic syndrome among hypertensive patients for the problem, and the research question can be what is the prevalence of metabolic syndrome among hypertensive patients. So this is one way of doing this, translating a perceived problem into a research question. So another example from pediatrics. So say you are interested in community pediatrics, and the particular disease or the health issue you are interested in is childhood obesity. Then the specific interest is psychological consequences of childhood obesity. And the population or the study setting you are going to take, say you are going to take students schooling in Kandy. And then the problem would be emotional toll of childhood obesity. And a probable research question is what are the psychological consequences of childhood obesity. So moving on, an example from the field of surgery. Say you are interested in burn injuries, and the specific interest is in epidemiology, and the population and setting is burns unit National Hospital Kandy, and the problem would be kerosene oil lamp burns among adults in estate sector. And the research question could be what is the epidemiology of burn injuries among population in the estate sector. So the final example is from obs and gynae. So the health issue or the disease, let's say it's not a disease, the health issue is early pregnancy bleeding, and then the specific interest would be the complications associated with early pregnancy bleeding. And so the population and the setting, let's say you are going to take neonates and the postnatal wards. So the problem is early pregnancy bleeding and fetal growth restriction. So the research question, does early pregnancy bleeding lead to fetal growth restriction? So this slide gives you another example of a translation of a research problem to a research question. So let's say you have this general problem of the research community does not know which sources and resources plagiarists use on the internet or the methods of analysis that beyond doubt could establish the likelihood of plagiarism. So there can be sub-problems like the sources of plagiarized academic material have not yet been identified. The resources for tracking and eliminating plagiarism has not yet been identified. It has not yet been determined how methods of text analysis could serve as forensic tools to assess the quality of ethical academic writing. So it is not yet known what the criteria for forensic evidence should be to establish plagiarism beyond doubt. So then based on these sub-problems, you can develop research questions. So, when we move on to the slides regarding the setting of objectives, you will see that we have the general objective and the specific objectives. So when we go there, you can relate back to this slide to see that general problem can be, our general objective later on, and the sub problems can be the specific objectives. So the research questions here could be serving us to set the general objective and the specific objectives too. So let's see how we can develop a research question using the PICO format or the PICOT format. So first and foremost, as the first step, you need to identify the clinical problem. Start by clearly defining the clinical problem you want to address. Let's say now in this case, the effectiveness of vaccines to prevent COVID-19 among elderly. And other than this, it could be a health issue or a medical condition, a treatment, a dilemma, a patient outcome of interest, or any other relevant concern in the healthcare setting. Okay, so then formulate the PICO or the PICOT elements. A PICO is an acronym that stands for, P stands for patient or the population or the problem. So define the characteristics of the patients or population you are going to study. Then the intervention, the I stands for intervention or the exposure. Later on, you can adjust this acronym into PICO, that means, okay. Specify the intervention or exposure you want to investigate. It can be a specific treatment, diagnostic test, or healthcare approach. Then the comparison, if applicable, identify the alternative intervention or exposure you want to compare with the primary one. Right, so this is used in case control studies or cohort studies where there's a control group. Then O stands for the outcome. Determine the outcome or result you want to measure or observe. Right, so then there's another column that I have not put here, which may not be used all the time, but it's the T if you are using the PICOT format. So if time is a crucial element, right, in your research question, then specify the relevant time frame. So in this example, effectiveness of vaccines to prevent COVID-19 among elderly, then the population is people over 60 years of age because we are using the elderly segment. And then the intervention is, let's say it's the Pfizer vaccine. And we are going to compare it with the Sputnik vaccine. And then the outcome, of course, is development of COVID-19 symptoms. So let's see how we can translate it into a question format. So is Pfizer vaccine more effective than Sputnik vaccine in preventing development of COVID-19 symptoms in people over 60 years of age? So similarly, you can now say you want to check whether one drug is more superior to another drugs. Let's say whether the drug A is more effective in treatment of hypertensive patients than drug B. So something like that. Then maybe you need to give a time frame also. So in elderly patients with hypertension, is medication A more effective than medication B in reducing blood pressure? Can be rephrased using the time frame. In elderly patients with hypertension, is medication A more effective than medication B in reducing blood pressure over a 6-month of period? So something like that. Okay. So now I think you must be having a clear idea about the research question, how to translate a perceived clinical problem or a research problem into a clearly defined research question. So we talked about the PICO framework there and what are the other factors you need to consider. So let's move on to research objectives. So if you define research objectives, It's a summary statement of what is to be achieved by the research project. So I think by now you have a clear idea about what a research question is, and I think you know how to translate a perceived clinical problem or a research problem into a clearly defined research question. We discussed about the PICO framework and the PICOT framework and other things related to uh, formulating a research question. So let's move to research objectives. So the definition of research objective is it's a summary statement of what is to be achieved by the research project. So let's talk a little bit about the characteristics of objectives. So we say that the objectives should be SMART. So what do we mean by that? So SMART objectives, are a framework for setting clear, specific, achievable, relevant and time-bound goals, right? So as you can say by now, the SMART here means, it's an acronym, and it stands for specific, M stands for measurable, A for achievable, R for realistic, and T for timeliness. So let's talk a little bit about the specific nature. So the objectives should be well defined and clearly focused. They should answer the questions like what needs to be accomplished, who is involved, uh, what resources are required, what is the setting, the study setting. So basically, at least you should give the study population and study setting and, who is involved, like things like that. Then the measurable component. So whether it's the objectives are measurable. Objectives should be quantifiable, so that the progress and the success can be objectively assessed. So you need to have this objectivity included into the objectives. You have to use measurable terms, and then moving on to the achievability. The objectives should be realistic and attainable within the given constraints, such as time, resources, and expertise. So you have to consider all these factors. Then they should answer questions like whether the objective is realistically achievable. And the relevancy, coming to the R, right? The relevancy, the objectives should align with the overall, general objective and whatever the mission and the visions of the sponsors and your institution, right? They should be relevant to the context and contribute to the larger objective. They should answer the questions like, does the objective align with our broader goal, right? And then the time-bound nature. Objectives should have a specific time frame or deadline for completion. Particularly if you are, a postgraduate student or an undergraduate student, or you are working under, certain sponsors, you have to be responsible towards that those people. Then there's somebody will be monitoring your progress, so you need to answer the questions like, by when do I will be able to achieve this objective? So that's about it, about the SMART objectives. Okay, so let's move on. Let's talk a little bit about the features of a general objective. Usually we have only one general objective for a given proposal, unless if you are having many components or many phases in your research. Then state what the researchers expect to achieve from the study in general terms. Okay, so this is like a broad statement of what is to be achieved at the end of the study. And the general objective literally helps you to write the title. Okay, remember that. So if when you are going to write the title, uh, you will be using the general objective, and vice versa. The title should cover the general objective. Okay. So moving on to the features of specific objectives. So this is a little different from the general objective we just discussed. So specific objective focus on more specific areas that need to be achieved from the research project in relation to the general objective. Okay, so it will identify the different components that need to be addressed to find an answer to the research problem, which is defined in broad terms as the general objective. So how do we come up with specific objectives? It is derived by breaking down the general objective into much more specific, logically connected parts. Okay, so as the specific objectives are to focus on more specific areas, actually, you can include more specific areas under specific objectives, which need not be included in the general objective, right? So in what I'm trying to say is that all the components of the specific objectives may not be included in the general objective, right? But whatever is included in the general objectives should be stated in the specific objectives. Two important features of specific objectives include the use of action verbs and operationalization. So operationalization of specific objectives involves actually breaking down each objective into concrete, measurable and observable actions or indicators, right? And this process transforms abstract objectives into specific steps that can be implemented and measured. We will be discussing that more in subsequent slides. So in addition to operationalization and use of action verbs, these are some of the points that you need to consider. These specific objectives are usually focused, okay? So each covering a single point, and they are coherent, cover the problem and the contributing factors in a rational way, and they should be actually ordered. So there should these specific objectives should be stated in a logical sequence. So all these things matter when it comes to specifying your specific objectives for your study. So let's see about the purpose of writing research objectives. So if you can remember, initially we stated that it's like, the road map or something, the research aims, the objectives, and these particular types of objectives, the specific and the general objectives. They are kind of, the road map, a part of the roadmap to the successful completion of your research. So the research objectives focus the study. It narrows down to its essentials. So it's kind of, as we stated, it's a roadmap, and avoid collecting of data not relevant to the study. So it really can save you time and resources, and organize the study in clearly defined parts or phrases, facilitates the development of methods orients the collection, analysis, interpretation, and utilization of data, and directs how results should be presented and discussed. Okay, so please note the words in red, so it's easier if you can remember these things. Okay, and the general objective, purpose of writing general objective is, again, it focuses on the problem, identify the population and samples, select a study, design and organize the stages and steps in the study, and write the title. I told you in one of the earlier slides that the general objective helps to organize the title and vice versa. Okay. So in the previous slide, we discussed about the purpose of writing specific objectives. So this slide gives you the purpose of writing specific objectives, right? So the specific objectives define your study population and sample in more specific terms, okay? So they discard unnecessary information collected during the literature survey. So you gather a lot of data and information during a literature survey. So, but when you write down your specific objectives, you become more focused. So therefore, the unnecessary information collected can be discarded. And then write eligibility criteria and identify and define study variables, develop the questionnaire, construct dummy tables, choose appropriate statistical procedures, including statistical tests, and interpret the results and write the report manuscript in a logical order. So as you can see, the specific objectives help you to do all the steps in your research. Okay, so it's really important that you lay down your specific objectives smartly. Right, so the writing objectives, we discussed about the operationalization of variables and the action verbs earlier on. So let's see what is operationalization of variables means. So operationalization means converting all variables into objectively measurable terms. Okay, so operationalization enables even the subjectively assessed variables to be measured empirically and quantitatively. So for an example, let's take obesity. Now, as you know, obesity is a subjective variable. Who is obese to me may not be obese to you. So that is the case unless someone is extremely obese, right? So different people may categorize obesity in their own perspectives. So weight of one person, maybe considered as obese or not by one person, while the other think otherwise. So anyway, but by operationalizing this obesity by using the body mass index, for an example, you can operationalize it. You can bring it to measurable terms that can be applied by anybody. This makes it very scientific, objective, and standardized in applying across all the research participants. So whoever carry out the data collection, whoever participates in the study, so the results would be the same because you have operationalized the obesity here. Okay. So moving on to action verbs. So action verbs are also known as measurable terms. So what are the action verbs? The action verbs are using verbs that are specific enough to be evaluated, measured when formulating the objectives. For an example, to assess. So if you are interested in assessing the knowledge, attitudes and practices, for an example, you can use the term to assess. To compare. So if you want to, compare efficacy of vaccines received by two persons or to compare drugs, medications received by two groups, so you can use the action verbs to compare. To compute the relevant indices, particularly in epidemiology, you may have to compute relevant indices, the maternal mortality rate, the prevalence, the incidence, and so on and so forth. Then to describe the pattern of injuries, for an example, you may need to describe. To determine, for an example, to determine the prevalence of multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children, which is known as MIS-C, following COVID-19. To establish the reliability of a questionnaire, to explore the contributing factors for school injuries, to identify different strains of SARS-CoV-2 virus, to verify accuracy of an instrument. So these are some examples for this particular action verb. So there are certain verbs that you need to avoid when you are using when you are writing objectives. So you have to avoid non-action verbs like to appreciate, to show, to study, to understand. These are not accepted. So how you appreciate something may be different from how I appreciate. So there's subjectivity connected. So you need to avoid these things. Okay. So other than that, when writing objectives, you need to include this information. So make sure that you always start objectives by using to and should include information on what you will do, that is the activities you will be carrying out in your study. Those should be specified using operational or working terms, and then on whom the study population you are going to study, in this particular research, then the study setting to which the study participants belong to, and not the study setting where the study is done. Okay, for an example, you may be a university academic, but then you are going to perform this research in a school maybe. Then the study setting would be the school, not the university. Okay, have that in mind. So this is an example how you can write an objective using all the information that we discussed so far. So let's say the general objective is to describe the epidemiology, to develop and pilot a surveillance system, to detect school injuries of students, and to assess the safety of the school environment in an education division in Kandy. So the text gives you, the text in this pink color font gives you the information on what is going to be done, right? So you need to include all that information in your objective. And then this text given inside this blue color box, it's the study population. It's mandatory to have that. And then the text within the purple frame, that is the study setting. So you need to incorporate that piece of information also into your objective, right? So based on that general objective we discussed in the previous slide, the specific objectives can be to determine the incidence of school injuries in schools of the study area, and to describe the type of injury, part of body injured, location of the incident, and socio-demographic characteristics of those who are injured at school, and to determine the severity of the injuries sustained at school, to describe the initial management of school injuries, and to determine this access to medical care following an injury sustained while at school, to develop and pilot a surveillance system for injuries sustained while at school, to determine the risk factors for school-related unintentional injuries, to develop and utilize a tool to assess the safety of the school environment. Okay, so these are some of the specific objectives that you can develop using all the information that we talked through this presentation. So these are some of it. You may include some more, but this is a list of specific objectives that you can develop using the general objective we stated in the previous slide. So that brings us to the end of this lecture. So if you can remember, we discussed about the SMART objectives, operationalization of variables, and action verbs in this lecture, and we discussed how we can convert a perceived clinical problem into a researchable research question, and how we can do that in the first half of the lecture. So if you have any questions, I would be happy to answer. Please state them in the chat box or in the messages, under the messages in the YouTube channel. Okay, thank you very much.